Okay, so that's the basics of Hebrew, and I wanted to give you that aleph bet with the letters and the vowels because that's very important for knowing the other Jewish languages that evolve over time. Because once Hebrew is fixed as the holy language, and this is the alphabet that Jews use, even if they learn new languages, they begin to write them in this alphabet that's theirs. Right. So you can think of languages from the Middle Ages like Yiddish or Ladino, Judeo-X, which is medieval Spanish written in Hebrew letters. And there's a subtle distinction in that culture where Judeo-X was sort of the ordinary daily language, and Ladino was sort of the written version of it. It's not quite as stark a split as written Arabic and colloquial Arabic. That's a very big linguistic difference. This was subtly different, but they used different terms for that. And so you had these Jews who lived in medieval Spain, who picked up medieval Spanish as a spoken language with their neighbors, and they started writing original works in it. That's how they communicated with each other. When they started making newspapers, they wrote them in that. But it became part of a diaspora experience because, of course, they were expelled from Spain in 1492, and many left before, or from Portugal in 1497, where they were forced to convert and had to stay there for a while and were able to escape over time. So by the middle of the 1500s, you've got these Spanish-speaking Jews all over the place, and they're still speaking this language, which is a medieval kind of Spanish inflected with some Hebrew words. The same happens to Jews living in medieval Germany in the Rhine Valley, where they pick up the language around them. This happens around the year 1200 or so of the Common Era. They begin to speak this language. The first mention we have of it in writing is a little epigram written at the beginning of a prayer book from 1272, if you have a date on it. So it's around that time period people were starting to use this language. And so they also write it in Hebrew letters because that's what they're literate in, is in their alphabet. And of course, they pick up some of the concepts of that language too. What's fascinating about Yiddish as a blended language is that it actually shows Jewish history through the language. So the core language, like mama, tata, mommy, daddy, that's basic Germanic language. And we'll see when we look at an example of Yiddish text, it sounds very German. But it also includes a number of Hebrew terms in that language. For prayers, obviously Torah is Torah with a different accent, but wisdom is chokhmah. It's from the Hebrew term. Or Shabbat is not Saturday, it's Shabbos. It's the Jewish term for it. The pronunciation is slightly different in Yiddish. You often emphasize a different syllable, and a T at the end often becomes an S. So Shabbat in Hebrew becomes Shabbos, or Sukkot becomes Sukkos, or Simchat Torah becomes Simchas Torah. So it shifts the emphasis a bit to the different syllable and softens the end. But the words for the holidays, those kind of things, rabbis, etc. A second layer of language that's added is there actually are some Romance terms in Yiddish. So to bless something is bench. I was benching, or this is a bencher, is a blessings book. My mom used to sing a Yiddish song for holidays, Mir benchen die Licht, we bless the light. Bench is like benediction. It's from that Latin root. So there are a few words that make it through in Latin. And there are also a number of words that made it in from Slavic languages. Right? So for example, how do you say grandmother in Yiddish? Is babi.
Yeah,
which is like babushka, baba in Polish. I mean, it's the Slavic term for the grandmother. So it's some of these Slavic terms made their way into. And sometimes you'd even have two words for the same thing in different languages that have different resonances to them. So the best example of this is the Yiddish term for a book, an ordinary book, is a buch, just like the German buch, plural bicher. But if you have a very special book, or a holy book, or a religious book, then you would use the Hebrew word sefer. So you might ask, is this a buch or is it a sefer? In English, you're saying, is it a book or a book? I mean, you might say, is it a book or a tome? I mean, maybe use a fancier word for it. But this is where having these two languages allows you to get a subtlety of meaning for elevated or not. Or sometimes if you refer to someone as a chacham, as a wise person, you really mean he's a wise guy. He thinks he's really smart, but he's not really. So that's where, again, the layers of language make a big difference. But these were not the only two Jewish languages, Ladino and Jewish German or Yiddish. In fact, in Yiddish, the word Yiddish means Jewish. So originally it was Yiddish-Teich is what they call it, which is Jewish German. But there was a Jewish Greek, there was Judeo-Arabic was another language that was common in the Middle East, obviously. Some of Maimonides' works are written in Judeo-Arabic, where again, it's Arabic, but written in Hebrew letters again. So, yes.
Was there a Jewish language spoken by the Jews in China?
The Jews in China, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that they wrote it in their own alphabet, because Chinese writing was very well developed. My guess is that they spoke Chinese as a vernacular language over time, and used Hebrew for ritual purposes, but I don't know of them converting the Chinese language into an alphabetic
I
script.
think that would be tough.
It might be tricky, but
I mean, it's
I
written
know,
in
but I was
characters.
always curious about that, because
Yeah.
there was some back and forth.
Yeah, and there was also
Yes.
Jews in India too.
well, yeah, I mean, Jews trading back and forth, or are using the vernacular as they need to. I mean, look, Jews in Eastern Europe spoke Ukrainian or Polish if they needed to deal with the peasantry they were trading with, but that doesn't mean they wrote it in. They never picked up Judeo-Polish. They never did Judeo-Ukrainian because those were sort of the peasant languages. They didn't need to write them down. They wrote down what they needed for their own internal purposes, and if they needed to write in Russian, they learned the Russian alphabet.
Yeah, it seems
that thing.
what I find interesting is that it seems that my dad's family clearly spoke Yiddish, but they must have amount of Russian too, because he had a certain amount of Russian. Because during the war, he got sent to polish it up so that he became a linguist and a technical sergeant. So, so it's interesting because clearly they must have had both languages. They must have used both languages some in the home. Although I have no idea. No, I never thought to ask the question.
Yeah, well, I mean, it also depends on what period that they were experiencing Russian culture.
Well, they came over in around 1900. So.
Right. So if they were, I mean, certainly post-Soviet Jews are speaking Russian all the time because the Yiddish was stamped out. So things really changed in different time periods and through the 20th century. Just need to turn off one thing on the camera.
I don't know how long they were in Shanghai.
He was born there.
Well, again, also if you're attending schools, if you're going to the marketplace, you're going to pick up different languages.
You have to be able to interact with your neighbors if they're speaking different language.
Right.
There was he grew up in this Jewish community in Shanghai that had come from Poland, escaped from the Nazis.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I'm not sure how long he lived there, but I think he lived there until he went to college. He went to college in the United States, and he managed to stay here. So.
Well, this is an interesting feature about Jewish life in many places. Is they maintained a Jewish language even after they moved. For a period of time when they moved, they picked up a new language: Judeo-Greek, Judeo-Spanish, Judeo-German. But then they kept that language when they moved somewhere else and didn't drop it and didn't pick up Judeo-Polish or Judeo-Russian. And it's an interesting phenomenon that took place at a certain point in time. Maybe they just gotten too rooted in that new language and it was hard to let go. Maybe the local language was not esteemed enough to be worth it. But there's another factor that's described by the linguist Max Weinreich, who was one of the founding modern students of Yiddish and teachers of Yiddish. He describes something called internal bilingualism. So you have a lot of people that experience bilingualism, where they have one language at home and one language out in the street. So you think about Mexican Americans or Chinese Americans, they're speaking Chinese at home and they're speaking, English on the street. What made Jewish culture interesting and different in a way, for both the Ladino experience and the Yiddish experience, although Weinreich wrote about Yiddish, is they had this kind of internal bilingualism, where they had two languages, both for internal Jewish use. They had an everyday language, and they had a holy language, or a special language, which was Hebrew. In Yiddish, it comes out very neatly, where you have the Loshen Kodesh, the holy language, and you have the Mama Loshen. What's a Mama Loshen? It's what Mama speaks to you. It's your home language. It's the daily life language. It's the language of cooking. It's the language of the marketplace. And then the holy language is a language of holy time, of prayer, of legal study, and that has a different purpose. Both are internal to the Jewish community. You don't use Yiddish out with the Poles. You don't use Hebrew out with the Poles. You use Polish if you need to with them. And they actually pick up some Yiddish over time. There's a famous story that Colin Powell actually learned to speak Yiddish because he worked in a Jewish grocery store for a time when he was living in New York, and he picked it up. because it was what was needed for commercial communication. But by and large, these were internal Jewish languages. So this idea of internal bilingualism is something that's somewhat unique to Jews. So let me just show you a couple samples of Jewish texts in these languages. Okay, so this is from the book of Ruth, chapter 1. And here's the English translation. It came to pass in the days when the judges judged, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to stay in the fields of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons, Machlon and Kilion. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem in Judah. There's a pun in the Hebrew that we don't even get in the English, by the way. Bethlehem means house of bread, and there's a famine. So, surprise.
There
And
seem to
then
be a lot of puns in the Hebrew Testament. I mean, they point them out.
that you don't get.
That I would never get,
Right, exactly. Okay, so then Elimelech dies, and she's left with her 2 sons, and the story continues from there. Now in Hebrew, you'll notice I've put the font a lot bigger, but it's about the same length as you would see in the English. Normally Hebrew is actually a little more condensed because all the vowels are dots and dashes. They're not consonants. But if you were reading a Torah scroll for the first 5 books, that appears without vowels. You would almost never see the book of Ruth without vowels because that's in a separate volume. It's later in the Hebrew canon. So I'll just read a flavor of the Hebrew. So here again, the days when the judges judge. The word for judge and judging is the same in the Hebrew. And you get a lot of these 3-letter roots like shvot, shoftim, mishpat is a judgment. Beit mishpat is a court, a house of judgment. Vayhi ra'av ba'aretz, there was a famine or hunger in the land. Vayelech ish mi Beit Lechem, and the man went from the house of bread, Yehuda in Judah, lagur bisdei Moab, in the fields, to live in the fields of Moab. Hu v'ishto v'shnei banav, him and his wife and his 2 children. Another way that Hebrew saves room, by the way, is when you're saying his wife, you just add an ending, a suffix. It's a possessive suffix. You don't have to have a separate word, his wife. It just becomes wife his. And the word and itself is just the v added to the beginning of the word. It doesn't have to be a separate word either. So Hebrew is a much more condensed language than English might be. Now, if you turn to, and then here you have the transliteration in English letters for that passage. So here in Ladino, this is going to sound very different. Y fue en días de juzgar los jueces, y fue hambre en la tierra, y anduvo varón de Bethlehem, Yehuda, por morar en campos de Moab, él y su mujer y sus 2 hijos. Y nombre de el varón, Elimelech, y nombre de su mujer. I mean, this sounds very Spanish, right?
It does, yeah.
There's a slight accent that's a little bit different. Some of the grammar is slightly different.
Yeah,
But you can read it because if you know Spanish, it sounds very familiar. And if you try to read the Hebrew letters, it would take a while. But notice there's no dots and dashes, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because in Ladino and in Yiddish, they use the letters as vowels. So they don't just rely on the dots and dashes, they've turned the letters into vowels. So in a yud at the end becomes an E sound, and ah, and an aleph in the middle becomes an ah sound, and O is the O vowel, but without any dots on it. So they've turned letters into vowels in Ladino and in Yiddish for ease of reading and for fluidity. But notice how much longer the text is when you put the vowels in, right? Many more lines, even if it's the same size font. It's going to be a lot longer. And then when you get to Yiddish, again, you'll see it's even longer than the Ladino, because German, is not an economical language here.
All the verbs are at the end.
Right, right. So here's reading the Yiddish. Unes ist gewesen in die Tag, was die Schoftim haben geherrscht, ist gewesen a hungrig in Land. So
that's why I read in Spanish.
yes. And it was in the days when the judges had ruled, there was a hunger or a famine in the land, right? Unaman is gegangen, and a man went, but in Hebrew, in Yiddish or German, you'd say he is gegangen, he went, is gegangen von Bethlehem, from the house of Judah, sich aufzuhalten in Feld von Moab, to go into the fields of Moab, mit seinem Weib und seinen 2 Söhnen, and so on. So what you see in the Yiddish is there are some words that make it through. So the shoftim, that's the Hebrew word shoftim, right? That three-letter root. But to rule, it doesn't have to judge in Yiddish because there's a Germanic root term for that, so it uses that instead. So it's sort of a mishmash. And the other thing that would be tricky is you wouldn't necessarily know how to read that word with Yiddish because it's a Hebrew word by root. So the word Shabbat, for example, has three sounds: sh, b, t. But you don't know if it's shubut or shibit, except a Jew reading it would see sh, d, and know that, oh, that's Shabbat or Shabbos. But if you're a starting out Yiddish reader who doesn't know that that's a word from Hebrew that's pronounced, it's just one of those quirky words, like psychoanalysis or something, that you don't say the P, they wouldn't know how to read it. And during the Soviet Union period, where they wanted to purge the language of its Zionist and its religious connotations, they actually rewrote some of those words. So they would write Shabbos phonetically, so that a historic Jewish reader would understand what that word is. They'd have to pronounce it out loud. Say, why did you write it that way? You're supposed to write it the old Hebrew way. So orthography becomes political too sometimes. And and the old texts go down the memory hole, and you don't read them anymore. So this is just a few examples, a little flavor of the varieties of Jewish language, to give you a sense of how this culture was lived. You can read about the Jews living in Spain or the Jews living in Turkey, part of the Sephardic diaspora throughout the Mediterranean and into Amsterdam as well. One of the more famous synagogues there is the Sephardic Synagogue. Even in North America, the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue in New York is one of the oldest synagogues, and it's part of that Sephardi diaspora with its own particular cultures and traditions, a lot of which was embodied in that language. And there's even modern people trying to resurrect Ladino songs. We've used a couple in our high holidays, for example, or Hanukkah. There's a popular song from the 80s called Ocho Candelicas, 8 Candles, that was written by a woman named Flori Jagoda, who grew up in the Balkans, where there was a strong Ladino Sephardic presence, which unfortunately was wiped out during the Holocaust, but she was a survivor and she wanted to create new Ladino music, and so she wrote this song in the 80s, which has become very popular all over the Jewish world. And Yiddish as well has had its great decline after the Holocaust, where several million Yiddish speakers were killed and the rest were dispersed, and the heartland of Yiddish culture in Poland was destroyed. But there are still Yiddish speakers, certainly in the ultra-Orthodox world. They use it as their portable ghetto, so they can't experience outside culture. If they can't even read it, then that solves it. And they speak to each other in that internal bilingualist model. But secular Yiddish has sort of fallen on hard times. You've got some university studies classes that talk about it, but it's not a daily language for most secular Jews. There are still some Yiddish schools in Australia and Argentina and a couple other places, but most secular Yiddishists are very old, and Yiddish as a daily language is not what it was. But it still has cultural resonance for people. They know certain words, they know certain phrases. They have an attachment to it, and some of their kids and grandkids do study it in college and get connected to it in a new way.
Well, our brother-in-law, her sister's husband, the guy whose father was born in Shanghai, his grandfather was a noted Yiddish, Polish writer, and so he went to learn Yiddish. In Bucknell, or
I don't know where it is.
well, anyway, and so that he could read and translate his grandfather's writings, which date from the early 20th century.
The North Shore Senior Center has a Yiddish club.
Oh yeah, there are Yiddish clubs that meet and they read stories, they tell
But
jokes.
David didn't go there.
Are there any? There used to be a lot of Yiddish newspapers in Brooklyn, places like that.
There used to be a ton. There aren't as many anymore. There are still ultra-Orthodox papers that are printed for that audience, and they read them. And since they don't use the internet, it is still a print edition world, right? And the Jewish Forward, which was the longtime main, Yiddish paper, went through its own evolution, where initially it was all Yiddish. Then they had one English page. Then it shifted to being mostly English with a Yiddish page, and now they actually produce 3 editions weekly. They do have a Yiddish edition still that comes out. They have a Russian language edition, and they have an English language edition, but it's almost all online now. There's almost nothing in print. Again, that audience has just changed. I mean, when my mother was growing up, she went to a Yiddish sholot multiple days a week to learn to speak and read Yiddish because her grandfather was very involved in that Yiddishist world, and so she remembers a lot of songs from that period. She knows some phrases. She didn't raise us speaking it. That wasn't, it didn't make sense to do that. Plus, I don't think people realize the value of having multiple languages, because when you grow up bilingual, adding a third language is easier. And adding a fourth language is easier. It's just an advantage to give your kids that too many people don't do. So I do want to look at a couple of our discussion questions that we have in our course pack. We haven't done that most of the class because our topics have been a little bit all over the map. But in this case, we are on topic. This is a version of the Who's on First. That's a way of learning some Hebrew words, but because there are some words in Hebrew that sound like English words. So if you have the packet, you can look through it and see that example. So some common features across the historical Jewish languages. Well, we have those ritual words that come out of Hebrew.
Yeah, some Hebrew words clearly.
We've got the writing Hebrew letters, and that's meant for a Jewish audience. It's not being, they don't expect their neighbors to read it because they're writing it in their own unique alphabet. The grammar and basic vocabulary comes from the host language. There's often that holy language versus the mother tongue, Mama Loshen piece. And by the way, that does also come across as a status issue too. That the Mama Loshen, the mother language, is not seen as important as the holy language, the language of culture and high thought and so on. So early Yiddishists actually have to argue for the validity of Yiddish as a viable, important language, simply because it's looked down on. It's sometimes derisively called a jargon, because it's just a mishmash of all these different languages, and it's not a pure language like Hebrew was thought to be. And of course, it was the women's language, and so it was not seen as that important. Obviously, we have different values today. We also didn't pick up the literary language. There's no Jewish Latin. We didn't need to learn that. We needed a daily language to deal with the people around us, and so we picked up a Judeo version of the vernacular language at the times that they picked that up, but we didn't learn the written language. So Judeo-Latin didn't have a place. It didn't need to be done. So that didn't happen. What role does Hebrew play in Jewish history? Well, again, the language of prayer and study. It was generally the men's language. Women might have learned to recite a few prayers in Hebrew, but they didn't really learn it the way that men were expected to. And in our movement, it's a connection to the historic Jewish past, and certainly an avenue to connect with modern secular Israeli culture. And it enables us to, as you pointed out, to read the Hebrew Bible and get the jokes and understand some of the allusions in there that otherwise we might not. So it is a kind of basic literacy. And I've sometimes argued with some of our other communities that say, well, learning Hebrew takes so much time, it's so much work. We only get the kids for so many hours on a Sunday morning. Do we really want to spend the time learning Hebrew? And I say to them, well, it feels to me wrong to put kids out there who are literally illiterate in this basic Jewish alphabet that opens up the doors to whatever Jewish language you want to do. We actually had a student for his bar mitzvah who wanted to do a Yiddish reading instead of a Hebrew reading. So he went through our Hebrew program to learn the alphabet. And then he and I worked together on how to read Yiddish, and we found a nice reading for him to use.
It's interesting in a way because, it's kind of the reverse of Latin, what's happened to Latin, because Latin was used as the holy language, but only certain people were restricted to being able to use it because nobody else, you don't understand it. We have to tell you what it is. And that's the difference, a lot of difference, I think, between Catholicism particularly and Judaism is the idea that you need this layer of people who can read the Bible for you. And then what happened after Vatican II, or whatever it was.
Right, when they translated it.
Then they said, okay, now we can translate it. So now you don't need to learn Latin at all. So now except for the more conservative folks or people that really want to look at original texts, it's disappearing.
Yeah.
Totally.
Well, the challenge in Jewish life, though, was that most Jews were not literate enough to create Hebrew, or even to understand it. They could recite it. But reciting and understanding are two very different skills.
Right.
Decoding the sounds of the letters to pronounce it is one thing, or to sing it, with the cantillation with the Torah reading is different from creating language or reading for comprehension. So the reading for comprehension still was a more limited audience among Jews. There was an expectation of broad male literacy, so that was a plus. But there were many Jews who were really literate in Yiddish because they knew the Hebrew letters and they spoke Yiddish, so they could write in Yiddish. They were fully literate in Yiddish. They were partially literate in Hebrew, and it was rabbis and the elites and the people who had the money to study, the leisure time to study, given by money, that were really literate in Hebrew.
Yeah, but I think that what I'm trying to get at is that, like Arabic and the Quran, there's an attachment of the normal of the average person that I can aspire to learn this so that I can read the text. Where in Catholicism, Luther obviously had a different view of all that, but as far as the Latin goes and Christianity, Catholicism, it was like, no, you don't need to learn this. We'll read it for you. So there was not that attachment to reading, to aspiring to learn Latin, so you could read the Bible, unless you had an interest in doing that specific layer of clericism.
Right.
You follow, but for a Jew, like Tevye says, I could spend the time and study with them. The average Christian in medieval Europe didn't aspire to that.
Right.
Whereas the Jews do, and so do people that read the Quran. Wherever you live, if you could get the Arabic for people who are non-Arabs, that's tough. But they can aspire to learning that because they want to read the Quran in the original.
Right. And there's a value presented of being able to do that.
Right.
That should be accessible.
And that was kind of my point.
Yes.
Which is why I think that it retains this, even for secular Jews, it retains that sort of connection.
Well, and we've gone through we've gone through debates back and forth in our movement as well about how much Hebrew to include in a service. If we did it like a conservative service that was all Hebrew with some tweaks to make it humanistic,
you'd lose most of
we'd lose most people because they wouldn't understand it, and they wouldn't have enough of the emotional attachment to the sounds to want to stick it out. But if we had zero Hebrew, and at one time, I know that one of our early rabbis actually didn't even want to bother putting the Hebrew letters in the text. He would just put the English transliteration, and that would be it. That was a loss too, because some people do know how to read those letters, and they feel some kind of cultural attachment to seeing those forms or whatever. But does it alienate people who never learned them, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish? Right? We have both in our community. So it's again a balancing act that we've tried to strike over how much and to use the vowels and the Hebrew letters or not. Do we just put an English letter? We try to do all of the above, and we'll even put a literal translation if we have a singable translation that isn't exactly what the Hebrew says, because we want people to know what's being said. But that isn't the historic Jewish practice. The historic practice was say the Hebrew, and then if you want to understand it, hear the Aramaic Targum or whatever. My father actually remembers he grew up in a Syrian background Jewish synagogue, but in Brooklyn, where a lot of the Syrian Jews wound up. And he remembers them in the synagogue, this would have been in the 40s, singing the Torah reading and singing the Targum translation, even though they spoke Arabic as their daily language, or by the kids growing up in America, they were speaking English and they understood the Arabic. My grandmother would say things once in English, once in Arabic, and once in English, but it was the same thing. She just, that was her national language, and of course all of her swear words and epithets, and that was all Arabic. I mean, one of the interesting details of that was the word for a black person was abd, which is Arabic for slave. Ebed.
There's a history to that.
Yeah, that was her term.
So I have a quick question. The Jewish community that survived in Palestine, through the ages, that didn't join the diaspora, did they continue to speak Aramaic, or did they basically speak Arabic?
They evolved into Arabic.
So basically everybody before 1800, let's say, the people that lived in that area were all speaking Arabic.
Yes, although remember the Ottoman Empire is in control for a period of time, so they're using Turkish for government business and so on.
Right.
There are also waves of other immigrants that come in. There are Ashkenazi Jews who make their way in. There are a lot of Sephardic Jews that make their way in, particularly just Sfat in the north, so they're maintaining that Ladino culture. So it really is a mishmash of different Jewish languages in one place. which is one reason why sometimes they actually would rely on Hebrew to relate to each other, because it was the one language they had in common from all those diasporas.
Interesting.
So, do we have any version of internal bilingualism today in Jewish life? I don't really know. I mean, Hebrew is still emphasized as an important Jewish language, and it's still used as religious, for religious purposes around the Jewish world. But honestly, if you want an international language that most Jews speak, it's English. It's not Hebrew anymore. And what caused the decline of these Judeo-X languages, and do they have a chance for rebirth? Well, kill a lot of those Jews.
Part of it was the Holocaust.
I mean, Hitler's cause number one.
Part of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, and acculturation. You know, once you're allowed to be a citizen and you're allowed to move into a different suburb, and you're not an immigrant anymore. You know, America's where languages go to fade. I mean, it happens to Latino immigrants, right? Even though they have a regular flow of new immigrants. I did a wedding for a couple. The last name was Lopez. For the non-Jewish partner, he didn't even speak Spanish because his grandfather was the one who had immigrated, and he didn't have enough of the cultural connection to even speak Spanish or want any Mexican elements in the ceremony. So, you know, this is what happens, and people fight back against this. You know, they send their kid to Norwegian camp, Swedish camp in Minnesota.
But the problem is that we don't live, for the most part, many of us don't live in isolated communities anymore.
Right.
I mean, literally, the community my father grew up in was entirely Jewish. And boom, that was it. The Italians lived over here, the Irish lived over here, they lived over here. That broke down. Well, where I grew up on Long Island, I mean, literally, except for my mother and Mrs. Goldman, they were the only the only Shiksas in the entire community. Everybody else was Jewish. And then the non-Jews lived over here in East Williston. We lived there all the time. But that's not true anymore. You go back to my neighborhood now, and there's Indian folks, and there's black folks, and there's
because they banned racial covenants and discriminatory housing.
But the Jews have been more accepted, and they moved into lots of different places.
Well, they were also white. I mean, they were taken as white. Which,
but that community is not. We still have places like Highland Park and stuff that are heavily Jewish, but it has broken down quite a bit in there. And I think that people of the next generation and generation after that from us are moving all over the place, you know, small town American, big town American, but they're not.
So one of my son's favorite video series, there's a guy in New York City who spent a year studying in Beijing. So he speaks very good Mandarin and also learned some other Cantonese and Fujianese and some other dialects, but he looks like a white American. I think he's actually Jewish as well. But he'll walk into these places in Chinatown in New York, and he'll start out like a mindless tourist who doesn't know what he's doing or whatever. And then all of a sudden he'll switch over and start talking in fluent Chinese to the right, and they're all shocked. And part of the point is the sort of surprise video thing. But what's funny about those videos is that I would say maybe in a third of them, the older people who are speaking to him compliment him on his Chinese. And they say, I wish I could get my kid to speak Chinese like this. Oh, I can't even, they won't even talk to your Fujianese is so much better than hers. It's that complaint of the immigrant who wants their kid to know the language, and they just don't. So this is the problem with Ladino and with Yiddish. It's just really hard to inculcate the value of learning this language. Now, I knew a professor of Yiddish at University of Michigan when I was there, who was speaking to her infant and 2-year-old in Yiddish, because she wanted them to grow up with that as their living language. But it's really hard to do. I tried it with my daughter in Hebrew for the first couple of years, and it takes a lot of effort, and it takes delayed gratification. Because if you want your kid to be talking to you, they're going to talk to you in the language they hear all the time. And unless you surround them with that cultural influence all the time, it's very hard to.
I'll be honest, in my high school, I didn't know one kid who was Jewish of my generation that spoke Yiddish. And a lot of the parents could speak it, I'm quite sure, but I never heard it in anybody's home. I never heard anybody talk to their kids in Yiddish. Whereas where we live now, down here, I hear Russian, I hear Spanish, I hear Polish, you know, all the time.
Look, Russian Jews are trying to keep Russian in their families. I see it. I know Israelis who are living in America are trying very hard to make sure their kids are raised speaking Hebrew and being fluent in Hebrew. It's a tough road to home. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, doesn't radio and television have a lot to do with that too? Because my grandparents only spoke Pennsylvania Dutch. My dad understands it, but he couldn't speak it. not a word. I mean, well, maybe
Well, a few words.
But it was the television and then the radio, because that always came in English.
Yes.
He
And
knows as much Pennsylvania Dutch as I do Yiddish.
Yeah.
You know, from the
Well,
living in New York.
yeah.
But the other funky thing is that sometimes you would know how to hear it, but not how to read it. So my grandfather wrote a diary of a trip to Palestine he took in 1947 when it was still Palestine. My grandmother, this is my great-grandfather who went on the trip, my grandmother couldn't read it. She never learned how to read Yiddish, but she had someone read it into a tape recorder. And she could play the audio and she would understand it if it were read, so because she could understand the hearing. The other thing that happens sometimes is people would use Yiddish as a secret language.
Yeah, grandparents did that.
Because they want to talk to each other. But you see what that does is it ruins, if your goal is for the kids to learn the language, then you have to tell them what it means.
Yeah.
You know, using it as a secret language doesn't help them learn it.
Right.
It's the opposite agenda. And I appreciate it. I remember the tragedy in our house when our kids learned how to spell. And we couldn't say ICECREAM when we were discussing options because they knew what it meant. I mean, part of it is also classic conditioning, right? They hear those letters and then, then they get the ice cream. Then they learn.
Yeah.
So it's Pavlov, exactly.
My
They start drooling when they hear me spell. But anyway, so I understand the impulse, but this was the tragedy of Yiddish to some extent. And there's been a kind of renaissance of Yiddish with klezmer music and with academic opportunities to study it. But I don't know that it's going to become a daily language again. I don't think people are going to sing lullabies to their kids in Yiddish.
I don't see how that happens unless you have a community of people that speak the language.
Or you create a new country where you insist on it, like in Israel.
Like Israel, right.
And sometimes it was a real battle in Israel because they didn't want people to speak Yiddish. They wanted them to speak Hebrew. There's a famous story of a newspaper that wanted to print a daily Yiddish paper. And the government said that they were not allowed to print a daily Yiddish paper because they didn't have the correct movable type. You know what letters it's written in?
Yeah, anyway.
It's the same letters as Hebrew. What do you mean you don't have the right movable type? So what the Yiddish paper did was they published a Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday paper with one masthead and a Monday, Wednesday, Friday paper with a different masthead. Same staff, same printing press, same everything, but it wasn't a daily paper. It was a multi-time a week, two different papers. And that's how they tried to get around it. But people really did want to, minimize that Yiddish cultural possibility for the secular Israeli audience. A lot of the ministers in the government changed their names. They still knew Yiddish. That was their language they'd grown up with, but they changed their name to Hebrew names. So David Green became Ben Gurion, and a lot of the other people.
What's her name?
Golda Meir was
Meyerson,
right. They changed their name to Hebrew names as part of that agenda. There were even episodes occasionally of newspaper kiosks selling Yiddish papers that got firebombed or whatever, because you see, Yiddish was the language of diaspora. It was the language of exile. It was the language of the Holocaust and passive suffering and the old Jew in the old country. And here we are in the new country, and we want to reclaim our language. I mean, Ben Yehuda's Hebrew actually broke from Rabbinic Hebrew, because Rabbinic Hebrew was somewhat different from Biblical Hebrew. But when Ben Yehuda was creating his grammar for modern Hebrew, he modeled it on Biblical Hebrew. So it's actually easier sometimes for modern Hebrew readers to read Biblical Hebrew than it is to read Rabbinic sort of Mishnaic Hebrew, in part because of the Aramaic mixed in, but also just because it evolved differently. And actually, Rabbinic Hebrew is great. It's actually straightforward to understand the way it's structured. But they wanted to make that break from the old country, from the diaspora experience, from the religious experience, because they were secular. And so they went back to the Bible national identity when it was Judean. Now we're back in Judea. We're going to be using that good old Judean language. And so they reclaimed that grammatical form and were opposed to anything that would lead you astray or lead you to look back nostalgically. So even starting a Yiddish theater in Israel was a big production because there were some who were implacably opposed to that old world country. And just imagine the experience of the Jews from Arab countries moving to Israel, where they're told, your language is the language of the enemy. You have to speak it with this accent, which is how we've been doing it, and get rid of your hot and all that stuff. And if you have a secondary language, it should be Yiddish or European culture,
Which is like totally alien.
which is totally foreign to them. Exactly. So this is, the complexities of Jewish language in a nutshell. But there's also beauty to it too. The varieties of music that are part of Jewish life are only there because of the cultural dispersions of the Jews. And so the words they use to live Jewish life have been different, but you get something different in different cultures and different ideas. And I think there's a beautiful value to that too.